A Tesla shooting sparks in the middle of the night while the owner screams on her front lawn. That's where this story ends. And I promise you, when I spent 2 years building my off-grid solar system, that was absolutely not the outcome I had in mind. All I wanted was a quiet house, a little independence, and the deep satisfaction of powering my own life without touching the grid. But sometimes the moment you build something good, somebody else decides it belongs to them. In my case, that somebody was my neighbor Diane. Before I get into Diane, you need to understand who you're dealing with here. I'm an electrical engineer. Been doing it for close to 20 years. Industrial systems, power distribution, control panels, the kind of work where one wrong calculation can shut down an entire factory floor. I'm not a loud person. Never have been. I'm the kind of guy who'd rather spend a Saturday afternoon wiring a battery bank than arguing with someone at a backyard cookout. Which is exactly how I spent almost 2 full years of my life. Weekends, holidays, evenings after work. Piece by piece, I built what I always called my independence project. A fully off-grid solar setup. And I don't mean one of those basic rooftop installs that just takes the edge off your electric bill. I mean a complete, standalone system. Solar array across the roof and back shed. 3 battery banks in the garage. Custom inverters, manual transfer panels, everything engineered and installed by me, personally. When I finished it, the system could run my entire house with room to spare. On a solid sunny week, I was generating more electricity than I even needed. It wasn't about the money. Honestly, I probably dropped close to 30 grand building the thing. But there's something deeply satisfying about flipping a switch and knowing every single watt flowing through that wire came from sunlight hitting your own roof. No utility company, no outages, no dependency. Just quiet, clean, reliable power, and the knowledge that I built it myself. I even installed an outdoor charging port beside my driveway so I could plug in my truck's battery system and power tools when I needed to. It looked like a standard EV charger from the outside, but it was wired directly into my private system. That detail matters. Technically, that electricity never touched the public grid. It was mine, start to finish. For the first several months, everything was exactly as peaceful as I'd imagined. Friendly neighborhood, kids riding bikes down the street, neighbors waving from their driveways. Normal, quiet, suburban life. Then Diane Mercer discovered the charger. Diane lived 3 houses down from me. Early 50s, always dressed like she was heading into a town council meeting. Perfect hair, perfect posture, and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was also the president of our homeowners association. Technically, she'd been voted in, but from what I'd heard around the block, nobody else had actually wanted the job. So Diane took it, and then treated it like she'd just been sworn in as the mayor of a small city. Suddenly, the neighborhood had standards. Mailbox colors had to match approved tones. Trash bins couldn't be visible from the street. A guy down the block got a formal warning letter because his flagpole was slightly misaligned with community aesthetics. I wish I was making that up. Most people just rolled their eyes. But when I installed my solar panels, Diane noticed immediately. She showed up in my driveway one afternoon holding an actual clipboard, staring up at my roof like I'd mounted a satellite dish the size of a football field. "Those panels," she said, tapping her pen on the clipboard, "were not approved by the HOA Architectural Committee." I wiped my hands on a shop rag and walked over. "Good thing the city approved them," I said. "Permits and everything." She frowned. "Our guidelines state that visible exterior installations must maintain neighborhood harmony." I pointed toward the paperwork sitting in my open garage. "City code overrides HOA guidelines. You're welcome to read it." For a second, I thought she might push back. Instead, she just stood there staring at the panels, lips tight. People like Diane hate losing small battles. You can almost watch them file the moment away to use against you later. Sure enough, the tension never really disappeared after that. Whenever we crossed paths, she'd give me that polite, thin smile, the one that says, "We're not done here." And then for a while, nothing happened, until one night at around 2 in the morning. When you build a system like mine, monitoring software isn't optional. It's the whole game. Voltage levels, battery draw, load spikes. If anything unusual happens, your phone starts going off like a smoke alarm. So when that alert fired at 2 a.m., and it yanked me straight out of sleep. My first thought was that something inside the house had shorted out. But when I checked the monitor, the system was showing a massive external draw, way higher than anything normal, and that made absolutely no sense. Half asleep, I pulled on a jacket and stepped outside. Parked beside my driveway, glowing faintly under the streetlight, was a silver Tesla Model Y, plugged into my outlet. And standing right beside it, arms folded like she owned the place, was Diane Mercer. I just stood there for a second trying to process the scene. "Diane," I finally said, "what exactly are you doing?" She looked over at me like nothing about this was remotely strange. "Oh good, you're up." Then she actually gestured toward the charger. "You weren't using it overnight, so I figured it wouldn't hurt." I blinked. "You figured what wouldn't hurt?" She smiled. That same tight HOA smile. "Borrowing a little electricity." Now at this point, I honestly thought she was joking. I laughed once. She didn't laugh back. And in that moment, I realized she was completely, genuinely serious. That was when I understood something important about Diane Mercer. She truly believed that the rules applying to everyone else simply did not apply to her. Standing there in the dark, watching my system quietly pump power into her car, I had this strange, calm feeling settle over me. This wasn't going to end with a polite conversation. This was going to turn into something. And honestly, that night was just the beginning. Because when I checked my system logs the next morning and found out how long this had actually been going on, that's when everything changed. I made coffee, sat down at my workbench in the garage, and opened the system logs. I figured maybe she'd plugged in once before, twice at most, and I just hadn't caught it. But the numbers on screen told a completely different story. Every single night for almost 3 weeks, identical spikes in power usage. Always starting somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning. Always running 3 to 4 hours. Always pulling enough energy to charge most of an electric vehicle battery. My system tracks everything to the minute: voltage draw, inverter load, battery discharge, solar recovery. There was no question about what I was looking at. Diane had been walking over in the middle of the night and plugging her car into my private charger like it was a public charging station. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at the screen for a while. Here's the thing. The electricity itself wasn't even the main issue. Sure, it added up to a few $dozen each session, probably more, but that wasn't really the point. What bothered me was the sheer entitlement of it. The assumption that because something existed and was accessible, she could just take it. Around noon, I printed out the full usage reports, graphs, timestamps, power draw totals. It looked like something you'd bring into a courtroom. Then I walked 3 houses down and knocked on Diane's door. She answered wearing a blazer like she was expecting a business meeting. "Can I help you?" she said. I held up the papers. "I thought we should talk about last night." Her eyes dropped to the pages, then back to me. "Oh, that," she said. She didn't even pretend to be embarrassed. "You plugged your car into my charger," I said. "Well, technically," she replied, completely calm, "your charger is outside your home." I blinked. "And since we live in a shared residential community," she continued, "I assumed it was available when not in use." For a moment, I genuinely didn't know how to respond to that. "Diane," I said slowly, "that outlet is connected to my private solar system." She shrugged. "It's renewable energy." "That doesn't make it public." She crossed her arms. "You generate excess power anyway. I've seen your panels." I tapped the papers. "You've used roughly 80 kilowatt hours from my system this month." She tilted her head. "And that's electricity I paid to produce," I said. She actually laughed, out loud. "Oh, please, you didn't pay for sunlight." That line, I'll be honest with you, almost made me lose my composure. But I kept my voice steady. "I'm not trying to start a fight. I'm asking you to stop using it." She stared at me for a moment, then came that smile. Well, maybe if you didn't want people using it, you shouldn't have installed something that looks like a public charger. And then she closed the door right in my face. I stood there on her porch listening to the deadbolt click. That was the moment this went from annoying to completely absurd. But honestly, it still could have ended there. If Diane had just stopped, I probably would have let the whole thing go. Instead, about 5 days later, I opened my mailbox and found an official envelope from the Homeowners Association. Inside was a violation notice. Apparently, I was being formally cited for something called, and I had to read this 3 times, energy exclusivity practices inconsistent with community resource sharing. According to the letter, my solar system represented externally accessible infrastructure, and denying HOA members access could be interpreted as restricting shared utility benefits. I stood at the mailbox laughing like an absolute crazy person, because only Diane Mercer could invent a rule claiming that my personal solar system belonged to the entire neighborhood. That evening, I called my friend Marcus. Marcus had worked with me at a plant outside Phoenix before moving into residential electrical design. If you want someone to analyze a terrible situation with genuine enthusiasm, Marcus is your guy. I walked him through the whole thing, the charger, the logs, the HOA letter. There were about 5 seconds of silence in the phone. Then Marcus started laughing so hard I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "You're telling me the HOA president is stealing your solar power?" He finally managed. "Borrowing," I said dryly. "That's incredible." "Not helpful, Marcus." He was still chuckling. "So what are you going to do? You tried talking to her?" "She thinks sunlight is public property." He whistled. "Well, technically the sun does belong to everyone." "Marcus." I'm kidding." A pause. Then his voice shifted slightly. "You know, if someone kept plugging into a system like yours without permission, you could build a load response circuit." I leaned back in my chair. "A what?" "A protective voltage spike relay." Now, if you're not an electrical person, that probably sounds more intense than it is. The concept is actually pretty straightforward. You build a secondary port that looks completely identical to the real charger. But when something draws current from it, it triggers a controlled voltage surge that shuts the connection down instantly. Safe for the overall grid, but very unpleasant for whatever device just connected. "Nothing dangerous," Marcus said. "Just enough to fry a cheap charging cable. Or, scare someone into never touching it again." I stared out the garage window at the charger sitting in the driveway. The wheels in my brain were already turning. "You're saying build a decoy?" "I'm saying protect your system by educating the thief." He laughed again. "Engineers call that a learning experience." For the next 3 evenings, I worked on the design. I told myself it wasn't about revenge. It was about reinforcing a boundary that someone had made very clear she had no intention of respecting on her own. By Friday night, the setup was finished. From the outside, it looked absolutely identical to my normal charger. Same housing, same cable, same position near the driveway. The real outlet had been quietly rerouted inside the garage. The new one had what I'll generously call a personality. I also mounted a bright yellow sign directly above it. "Private power system, do not use." Clear enough for anyone with functioning eyesight, which of course meant Diane would ignore it completely. Saturday evening rolled in quietly. Neighborhood was calm, porch lights glowing, crickets going, normal suburban sounds. Around 11:30, I poured myself a glass of iced tea and sat down at the monitoring console in the garage. The camera feed had a perfect view of the driveway. Part of me genuinely wondered if she'd learned her lesson. Maybe the face-to-face conversation and the HOA letter had actually landed. Maybe she'd found a public charging station somewhere and moved on. Midnight came. Nothing. 12:15. Still quiet. I started to feel a little ridiculous sitting there in my garage, waiting for something that might not even happen. Then, at exactly 12:42 in the morning, headlights appeared at the end of the street. A silver Tesla rolled slowly toward my house, and I knew immediately Diane Mercer had decided the rules still didn't apply to her. She parked beside the charger like she'd done it 100 times, stepped out wearing pajama pants and a hoodie, looked up and down the street once, casually, like someone checking for a parking enforcement officer, then walked straight toward the outlet. The yellow warning sign was right there. She glanced at it, actually paused for a second. I remember thinking, maybe, just maybe, she'll reconsider. Instead, she shrugged, picked up the charging cable, and plugged it into her Tesla. Back in my garage, the monitoring screen flashed. Load detected. Relay armed. 10 seconds. That's all it took. Then the driveway lit up like someone fired a camera flash. A sharp crack of electricity, a burst of sparks shot out from the charger port. And Diane Mercer jumped backward with a scream that probably woke up half the neighborhood. Her Tesla went completely dark, just dead. I watched the whole thing on the monitor, sitting there with my iced tea, trying very hard to keep a straight face. Because technically speaking, the system had worked exactly as designed. What I didn't know yet was how Diane was going to react the next morning. I woke up to pounding on my front door, the kind of pounding that usually means something is on fire or someone is genuinely furious. For a second, I thought a delivery truck had backed into the house. Then I heard a voice through the door. "Open this door right now." I pulled on a sweatshirt and walked down the hall. Standing on my porch was Diane Mercer, looking like she had not slept a single minute. Behind her were two other HOA board members, a quiet older guy named Paul, who mostly kept to himself at meetings, and a younger woman named Erica, who I recognized from her evening dog walks. Both of them looked confused. Diane looked like she was ready to declare war. "You tampered with my vehicle," she said before I'd even fully opened the door. I glanced past her toward the street. Her Tesla sat in the driveway across the road, looking genuinely sad. The charging port was blackened around the edges. The cable she'd used was dangling like a piece of burnt spaghetti. "Morning, Diane," I said. "This isn't funny." Paul cleared his throat. "We're just here to understand what happened." Diane spun toward him. "What happened is he sabotaged community infrastructure." I couldn't help it. I laughed. "Community infrastructure?" She pointed at my driveway. "That charging station is connected to my private electrical system," I said. "You used it without permission, repeatedly. That's called stealing electricity." Her mouth opened slightly. Nothing came out. I stepped back inside. "Give me 1 second." She started yelling something behind me, but I walked calmly to the living room and picked up a thick binder from the coffee table. I'd put it together the night before just in case. Inside were printouts from the monitoring system, energy logs, timestamps, camera screenshots, and a clean summary of exactly how much power Diane Mercer had pulled from my solar system over the past 3 weeks. I stepped back outside and handed the binder to Paul. He flipped it open. The first page was a timeline. Night after night, charging session after charging session, each one clearly labeled with time, duration, and energy consumed. Paul adjusted his glasses and looked at Diane. "Diane," he said carefully, "did you actually plug your car into his system multiple times?" Diane crossed her arms. "That's not the issue." "It kind of is," Erica said quietly. Diane's eyes snapped toward her. "He created a hazardous device." I leaned against the porch railing. "It's a protective relay designed to prevent unauthorized loads." Paul turned another page. There were still frames from the security cameras. Diane walking up to the charger, plugging in, standing beside the car in the dark while it charged. Night after night after night. Erica leaned over his shoulder and said, quietly, "Oh, wow." Diane shifted on her feet. "That footage was taken without my consent." "It was taken on my property," I said. Paul closed the binder slowly. "Well," he said, "this definitely complicates things." Diane stared at him. "Complicates what?" He sighed. "You filed a complaint saying he was restricting access to community utilities. But this doesn't appear to be community utilities. He generates excess power and that still doesn't make it public property," Erica said. Diane's face went red. This neighborhood has standards. Yes, Paul replied, completely calm. And theft is usually one of them. That line landed in the kind of silence where you can hear everything. Birds in the trees, a lawnmower 2 houses away, normal Saturday morning sounds. Finally, Diane straightened her shoulders. This isn't over, she said. I shrugged. You're welcome to call a lawyer. She hesitated. Because here's the thing. If this ever reached a courtroom, those logs were going to become evidence. Very clear, very damaging evidence. She grabbed the binder out of Paul's hands and shoved it back at me. You'll be hearing from the board, she said. Then she turned and marched down the driveway. Paul and Erica lingered for a moment. Paul gave me a small nod and said quietly, nice system. Then they followed Diane back toward the street. I stood on the porch watching them go. Across the road, Diane was already on her phone, probably calling someone to explain the injustice of it all.
Her Tesla sat there in silence, not charging, not moving, just parked. A few weeks later, Diane quietly stepped down from her position as HOA president. Officially, she cited personal time commitments. But word had spread around the neighborhood about the late-night charging situation, and people had opinions. A lot of opinions. I never reinstalled the decoy after that. Didn't need to. Turns out once someone learns the hard way, they tend to respect boundaries. At least, most of the time. But every now and then, I still sit in the garage looking at the monitoring screen, thinking about that night when the sparks flew, and I have to laugh a little. Because here's the honest truth. All Diane had to do was ask. Seriously, if she had knocked on my door one afternoon and said, hey, any chance I could charge my car occasionally? I probably would have said yes. I genuinely might have. Instead, she assumed she could just take it. And sometimes the difference between asking and taking is about 10 seconds and one very loud electrical crack. Now I want to hear from you. Was I justified in protecting my system the way I did? Or did I go too far setting up that little surprise? I've heard both sides of that argument, and depending on who you ask, people land in very different places. Drop your take in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare or a neighbor who thought your property was public property, I absolutely want to hear that story. If this one hit close to home for you, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed, because there are plenty more stories exactly like this one where that came from. See you in the next one.